My son called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and the first thing he said wasn't hello. It was, "Dad, I need you to meet Derek's parents this weekend, and please wear something nice." I remember holding the phone against my ear, looking down at my flannel shirt, my worn khakis, the old leather boots I'd had resoled 3 times because I liked the way they fit. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked out the window at the oak tree in my backyard, the one my late wife planted the year our son was born. 41 years I'd lived in that house. 41 years and I still hadn't gotten around to replacing the weathered porch railing. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't see the point. "I'll wear something nice," I told him. I could hear the relief in his voice. That relief hurt more than if he'd just said nothing at all. My son is a good man. He has his mother's eyes and his mother's instinct to smooth things over before they crack. He's been with his fiancée for 2 years, and every time I'd met her, I'd liked her well enough. She's sharp, driven, ambitious, in the way young people are when they've never been humbled by the world yet. I don't say that critically. I was the same way once. Ambition is fine. It's what a person does with it that tells you everything. Her family, though. Her family was something else entirely. The dinner was at Hargrove on the Park, one of those restaurants with no prices on the menu and waitstaff, who speak to you like they're doing you a favor by taking your order. I arrived at 10 to 7 in a navy blazer and dark slacks, the kind of clothes I keep in the back of my closet for funerals and obligatory occasions. My son was already there with his fiancée, standing near the host stand, and when he saw me, he smiled, genuine, warm, and hugged me the way he's hugged me since he was a boy. That part was good. That part was always good. "Dad, you look great," he said. His fiancée kissed my cheek and said it was so good to see me, and gestured toward a table in the back room, the private dining area they'd reserved. The Calloway family had arrived before us, which I understood was intentional. These are people for whom arriving last is a power move. I saw Derek Calloway before I heard him. He was standing with a glass of something amber in his hand, turned sideways so that his profile caught the light. Late 30s, broad shoulders, the kind of jaw that looks like it was engineered for a watch advertisement. His suit was charcoal with a subtle sheen to it, the kind of suit that costs more than some people's monthly rent. He was laughing at something his own father had said, a booming laugh that took up more space than the room invited. His mother, a thin woman in a cream blouse with diamond earrings the size of my thumbnail, turned when we entered. She smiled at my son's fiancée with genuine warmth. Then she looked at me, and I watched the smile stay exactly where it was, while something behind her eyes recalibrated. Derek turned a moment later. "Arthur," my son said, because I'd told him years ago I didn't need to be introduced as dad in formal settings. It makes people feel like they owe me something before they know me. "This is my father." Derek stepped forward and shook my hand. Firm grip, the kind men practice. "Great to finally meet you," he said, and his eyes went from my face to my blazer to my shoes and back to my face in about half a second. He didn't think I noticed. Most people don't notice when they're being assessed by someone they've already dismissed. "You too," I said. "I've heard a lot about you." We sat. The wine came. Conversations started and layered over each other the way they do at these dinners, careful, exploratory, everyone feeling out the edges of the table's social geography. Derek's father was pleasant enough. His mother asked me what I did, and I said I was retired, which was the short version of the truth and the version I always use in rooms like this one. She nodded and steered the conversation toward the wedding. That's when it started. "We were thinking," Derek said, setting down his glass with the careful deliberateness of a man who is used to making proclamations, about Ashford Manor for the reception. My son nodded slowly. He'd mentioned Ashford Manor to me before. It was a historic estate about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with manicured grounds and a ballroom with coffered ceilings and a waiting list that stretched into the following year. "Beautiful venue," my son's fiancée said. She was glowing. She wanted it. You could see it in her face, that particular light a person gets when they've been wanting something for so long that finally saying it out loud feels like relief. "It is," Derek said. "We looked at 12 venues. Ashford is the only one that's appropriate." He said the last word the way some people say it, with a faint emphasis that makes you understand appropriate really means for people like us. His mother slid a folder across the table. I watched my son open it. His expression changed, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes that I've been reading for 30 years. Inside was a breakdown. Venue, catering, florals, photography, music, transportation. A figure at the bottom with too many digits. "We've divided the costs," Derek said. "Traditionally, the bride's family covers certain things. We've been generous in our assumptions." He paused. "We're hoping your family can cover your share by the end of the month so we can secure the deposits." My son looked at me. I looked at the number. $470,000. My son's half. My son had a good job. He worked hard. He was not, by any reasonable measure of the word, in a position to write a check for $235,000 and call it a contribution to a party. "That's quite a figure," I said. Derek looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "Quality has a cost," he said. "These things reflect on both families. We want the day to be appropriate." There was that word again. "Of course," I said. I did not say anything else. I folded my hands on the table and listened to Derek talk for the next 40 minutes about the venue and the guest list, 300 people, mostly Derek's professional contacts and family, and the photographer who was flown in from somewhere in Europe, and the floral designer who had done something or another for someone famous, and the custom invitations printed on some specific paper I'd never heard of, and the cake. The cake alone was $8,000. A number Derek mentioned with the same casualness someone else might use to describe a sandwich. My son nodded through most of it. His fiancée's hand was on his arm. She was happy. He was trying to be happy for her. I understood that. I've understood it my whole life, the way love makes you want to absorb things you might otherwise push back against. On the drive home, I sat in my truck, a 12-year-old Ford F-250 with 180,000 miles on it that I keep because it runs fine, and I have no interest in performing wealth for highway traffic. And I thought about my son's face when he'd looked at that number. I called him the next morning. "Dad, you don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," I said. "How much do you need?" The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence I recognized. The silence of a proud man accepting something he couldn't generate on his own. "Derek's family is covering more than half," my son said finally. "If I can just cover the venue deposit, the rest I can manage with." "How much?" I said again. He told me. I said I'd handle it. He said thank you in the voice people use when they can't figure out how to feel about something. Over the next 3 months, I attended 2 planning sessions that Derek orchestrated like military operations. There were spreadsheets. There were vendors who spoke in a language of luxury that seemed designed to make the uninitiated feel like trespassers. At the second meeting, a florist presented a vision for the centerpieces, and Derek asked my opinion as a courtesy, the way you'd ask a golden retriever what it thought of the upholstery choices. I said the flowers were beautiful. Derek's mother said, "Arthur, how sweet. You're such a good sport about all of this." I nodded. I smiled. I wrote another check. Outside the meeting, in the parking lot, Derek was on his phone. I passed close enough to hear him tell whoever was on the other end. "The old man's picking up the tab, so at least he's useful for something." He didn't know I was there. Or maybe he did and didn't care. I've found that arrogance often mistakes itself for invincibility. I want to tell you something about the way I've lived my life. I grew up without much. My father was a machinist. My mother cleaned houses. We were not poor in the way that breaks people, but we were close enough to broke that I understood from a young age exactly what money meant and what it didn't mean. What it meant was options. What it didn't mean was worth. I built my first business at 26 with money borrowed from a credit union and a handshake from a man who believed in me more than the numbers did. By the time I was 35, I owned 3 properties. By 45, I'd built something I won't describe in detail here, because I never describe it in detail. Not at dinner parties, not at planning sessions for $8,000 cakes. By 62, when my wife got sick, I sold a portion of the company at a figure that would take most people multiple lifetimes to accumulate. And I used some of it for her treatment, which didn't work, and kept the rest in places where it would grow quietly, while I wore flannel shirts and drove a truck with 180,000 miles on it, and nobody looked at me twice. That's the thing about old money. It learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room is almost never the most powerful one. The wedding was on a Saturday in early October. Ashford Manor in autumn is genuinely one of the more beautiful things I've seen, the grounds going amber and rust, the old stone of the building catching afternoon light like something out of a painting. I'll give Derek that. The man had taste, even if he had nothing else worth giving. I arrived early, as I always do. My son had asked me to be there by 2 for photos. I wore the suit I'd had made in 1998, a charcoal wool that still fit because I've been roughly the same weight for 30 years. My son, when he saw me, grabbed me in a hug and held on for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said into my shoulder, "for everything. It's your day," I told him. "Just be happy." The ceremony was at 4. 300 chairs on the south lawn, the kind of setup that costs as much as a house in some parts of the country. Derek stood at the altar looking like he'd been assembled specifically for the occasion, and I thought, watching him, that there is a version of this man underneath all the performance who might have been decent. But that version had been so thoroughly buried under the years of presentation and acquisition and point scoring that I wasn't sure it could find its way back out. My son's fiancée, my daughter-in-law, I should say, because by the time I tell you what happened next, she was already walking down the aisle, was beautiful. Whatever else I thought about the planning and the cost, and the folder with the number at the bottom, she was genuinely beautiful that day, and I was glad my son had found someone who made him look the way he looked when she appeared at the end of that aisle. The reception moved inside at 7. The ballroom was everything Derek had promised. The lighting, the flowers, the music from a 12-piece band that had flown in from New York. I sat at the family table and ate my dinner and spoke with the people around me and watched my son dance with his new wife. And for a few hours, I let myself simply be a father at his son's wedding, which is all I wanted to be. Then came the toasts. Derek had arranged them in a specific order. His best man first, a college friend who told a story that was amusing and appropriate. Then Derek's father, who spoke at length and well. Then Derek himself rose, which wasn't traditional but wasn't surprising, and spoke about the future he and my daughter-in-law were building, and the kind of life they intended to have, and somewhere in the middle of it he gestured toward his own parents and called them pillars, and then he gestured generally in the direction of my son and me, and said something about how he was grateful that everyone had contributed what they could. What they could. He said it with such a particular, deliberate smile, the kind of smile that knows exactly what it's doing. There was applause. I clapped. My son caught my eye from across the room, and I gave him the smallest nod I could that said, "It's fine. It doesn't matter. This day is yours." After the toasts, the cake was brought out. The famous $8,000 cake. It was, objectively speaking, a work of architecture. 7 tiers, white fondant, hand-painted gold detail, fresh flowers woven through each layer. The baker had been flown in from Chicago. I'd heard this detail mentioned 4 separate times during planning, as though the geography of the baker's origin added flavor. The cutting ceremony is always a little chaotic at big weddings, the crowd pressing in, the photographer maneuvering, the DJ narrating. My son and his wife cut the first piece together. There was the customary moment of will they, won they, before they gently, sweetly fed each other a small bite. Everyone laughed and cheered. I was standing about 6 feet back from the table, a glass of club soda in my hand, watching my son's face. Then Derek was beside me. I don't know if he moved there deliberately or if it was simply the geometry of a crowded room, but suddenly he was close, and then his hand was on my shoulder, the kind of grip that is not quite friendly, and he leaned in and said, loudly enough for the 6 or 8 people nearest to us to hear, "You know what, Arthur? You should have a piece. After all, it's the most expensive thing you've ever been near." He laughed. The people who heard laughed, uncertainly, the way people do when they're not sure if something is a joke or not. I looked at him. I didn't say anything. He reached past me, took a small plate from the dessert table, and held it out with the smile of a man who has never once been made to feel embarrassed about anything he's said or done. "Go ahead," he said. "Enjoy it. Lord knows you couldn't afford a slice on your own. There was a moment of very particular quiet around us. Not silence. The band was playing. The room was full, but a pocket of quiet among the people who were close enough to hear. I saw Derek's mother, a few feet away, pretend she hadn't heard. I saw one of Derek's friends look at his shoes. I saw my son's wife turn to say something to someone and miss the whole thing. My son was across the room. He hadn't heard. I took the plate from Derek's hand. I set it down on the table. I looked at Derek Calloway for a long moment, the way I've learned to look at people over 65 years, not with anger, because anger is expensive, and I've always been careful with my spending, but with a very calm, very clear attention that tends to make people uncomfortable when they realize they've underestimated something. "Thank you for the offer," I said. "I'll pass." I set my club soda down and excused myself to the terrace. Outside, the October air was sharp. I stood at the stone railing and looked out at the grounds, the tent lights, the parked cars on the gravel drive, the old trees at the property's edge. Ashford Manor. I'd known this place for a long time. Longer than Derek Calloway had known it existed. I took out my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a man named Gerald Oakes, who has been my attorney for 22 years, and who answers his phone on the second ring regardless of the hour, because he knows that I don't call without reason. The second was to a woman named Patricia Holt, who manages a portfolio of commercial properties across 4 states on my behalf, and who also answers quickly. The calls were brief. I'm not a man who requires lengthy explanations when the direction is clear. I went back inside. The rest of the evening proceeded. I danced once with my son's wife, who thanked me for everything with what I believe was genuine feeling. I had a second glass of club soda. I spoke to people I liked and smiled at people I didn't know. Derek made the rounds like a politician, shaking hands, drawing laughter, working the room with the fluency of someone who has been performing himself for so long he's forgotten there was ever anything else. Just before 11, Derek was at the bar. His jacket was off. His tie was loosened. He'd had enough to drink that his eyes were operating a half-second behind his face. His own brother-in-law approached him. I saw this from across the room and said something to him, handed him his phone. Derek looked at the screen. I watched him read. The color change was gradual, then rapid, like something draining. He looked across the room and found me. I was standing near the entrance to the hallway, talking to my son. I saw Derek Calloway's face go through several expressions in the space of about 3 seconds. Confusion, recalculation, and then something I can only describe as the specific fear of a man who has made a catastrophic error and only just understood the scale of it. I'll tell you what was on that phone. Ashford Manor was not, at the time of Derek's wedding, owned by the Ashford family or by any of the event management companies that ran it. It had been sold 8 years prior. It was part of a hospitality portfolio that operated under 3 different holding company names, as many of these properties do, because the ownership structures of real estate at a certain level are rarely simple. The entity that ultimately sat at the top of that ownership chain was a firm I founded and still controlled. I owned the building. I had known this when my son told me where the wedding would be held. I had said nothing, because it wasn't relevant. My son's happiness was relevant. The day was relevant, and I had no desire to make it about anything other than what it was. I had paid the venue fees like any other client. I had been treated like any other client, which is to say I had been treated in accordance with the way I looked, which is to say I had been looked past by the coordinator and spoken to with careful patience by the catering manager, who assumed I was confused about the menu options. None of that mattered. What mattered was what Gerald had confirmed during my call on the terrace, that Derek's company, Calloway Meridian Partners, had a capital loan drawn through a financial intermediary that ultimately traced back to a fund I held a controlling interest in. The loan was significant. The loan was, in fact, critical to a development project Derek had been working on for 2 years. Gerald had sent that documentation to Derek's brother-in-law, who was also Derek's business partner, because Gerald had been very specific about who to send it to and when. Derek crossed the ballroom toward me. He walked fast, that particular walk of a man trying not to run. "Arthur," he said. He stopped in front of me. My son looked at him. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" "Of course," I said. We stepped into the corridor. Derek had the folder open on his phone. His voice had lost its performance quality. What remained was something younger, more uncertain. "This documentation," he said. "Gerald Oak sent this to Marcus. Marcus handles our financing." "I know who Marcus is," I said. Derek looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since we'd met. "The Hargrove Group," he said, meaning one of the holding companies. "That's yours." "It is. And Ashford. Among other properties, yes." He was quiet for a moment. The music from the ballroom came through the door. Something slow, something with strings. "The Meridian loan?" Derek said. He said it the way a person says something they're hoping isn't real. "Gerald will be in touch next week," I said. "There's nothing to worry about tonight. This is a wedding." Derek's jaw moved. I could see him running calculations, the way a man does when the ground he thought was solid turns out to be something else. I wasn't aware that you... "No," I agreed. "You weren't." There was something I could have said in that moment that I chose not to say. I could have told him that the way a person speaks to someone they've decided is beneath them is the most reliable measure of their character. I could have told him that I had spent my life building things in the presence of people who looked past me, and that being overlooked had never once slowed me down. I could have told him that the $8,000 cake he'd handed me a slice of tonight was sitting in a building I'd owned for 8 years. I said none of it, because the point was never to humiliate him. The point was something more precise than that. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, and I kept my voice the same way I've kept it in every boardroom, every negotiation, every moment when the stakes were high enough to make lesser men loud. "My son loves your sister. I believe your sister loves my son. That matters to me more than any of this." I gestured between us the corridor, the context, all of it. "The loan situation will be addressed professionally. You and I don't need to be adversaries." Derek looked at me. I could see him trying to identify the shape of what I was offering. "But I want you to understand something," I continued. "The way you spoke to me tonight in the ballroom, at the cake table, that is not something I'll absorb quietly a second time. Not because of the money or the buildings or any of it, but because I'm that man's father." I nodded toward the ballroom, toward my son, and a father's dignity is not a ledger item. Derek was quiet for a long moment. The music changed to something with a stronger rhythm. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. He said it plainly, without the performance quality. I believe he meant it, or at least meant the shell of it. "You do," I said. "But tonight you owe my son and his wife a wedding. So let's go back in there. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because that's where the real story lives." Gerald contacted Marcus on the Monday after the wedding. The conversation was professional, documented, without drama. The terms of the Callaway Meridian loan were renegotiated not punishingly, because I'm not interested in punishment as a primary objective, but clearly, with new oversight provisions and a revised structure that gave my representatives a more direct visibility into how the funds were being deployed. Derek's project would continue, but the terms of the relationship had been clarified. Derek called me on a Wednesday afternoon, about 10 days after the wedding. I let it ring, then called him back that evening. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the corridor." "All right," I said. I've been thinking about a lot of things." He was quiet for a moment. "I grew up watching my father make a lot of money, and I learned that money meant something, that it told people who you were. I don't know when I stopped questioning that." I listened. "I was rude to you," he said. "Not just at the wedding. I was rude to you from the beginning. I made assumptions." "You did," I said. "I'm sorry for that." I believed him more than I had at the wedding. Adversity has a way of stripping the performance off a person and leaving something more honest underneath. I didn't know yet what Derek Callaway looked like without his performance, but this conversation was at least oriented in the right direction. "I accept that," I said. My son called me that same week, separately, not knowing about Derek's call. He said his wife had told him what Derek had said at the cake table, that another guest had mentioned it. My son's voice was careful and low in the way it gets when he's trying not to show how angry he is. "Dad," he said. "I know," I said. "Are you?" "I'm fine," I said. "I've been fine. I want you to be fine." I can't believe he... My son stopped. He doesn't know you at all. He's learning, I said. There was a pause. What does that mean? It means people grow, I said, if they're given the right conditions. My son was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed a small, surprised laugh. You're frustratingly reasonable about things, he said. I've had practice. In November, I was invited to Thanksgiving dinner at the Calloway family home. This was Derek's mother's invitation, offered through my daughter-in-law, and I understood it for what it was, a recalibration, an acknowledgement, a door being opened in the direction of something different. I brought wine, good wine, the kind that doesn't announce itself on the label because it doesn't need to. Derek's mother mentioned it was exceptional. I said I'd found a good shop. Derek and I sat next to each other at dinner. We talked about the development project, about the city's zoning situation, about a neighborhood I knew well because I'd owned property there for 15 years. He was smart, genuinely smart. Underneath the performance, I found myself interested in what he was saying, which surprised me more than anything that had happened since the wedding. After dinner, when the others had moved to the living room, he poured 2 glasses of something and handed me one and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said. "Why didn't you say anything? At the wedding? You could have, you knew what you were sitting on. Why didn't you just—" "Because it was my son's wedding," I said. "Not a transaction." Derek looked at his glass. Most people would have. Most people confuse having power with needing to use it, I said. I've been making that distinction for 40 years. He was quiet. My father always said the point of having leverage was showing people you had it. Your father and I see things differently, I said, without judgment. Yeah, Derek said. I'm starting to understand that. I want to be clear about what the story is and isn't. This is not a story about revenge. I know that word gets attached to situations like mine, and I understand why there's something satisfying about the arc of a man who is underestimated and then revealed, who is dismissed and then discovered. But revenge is about making someone else feel what you felt. That was never my intention. What I wanted was simple, for my son to be happy, for the people around him to understand that decency is not optional, and for Derek Calloway to have the experience of being made to sit with the distance between who he presented himself to be and who he actually was. Not to crush him, to give him the chance to close that distance. Whether he takes it, that's up to him. My wife used to say that the most dangerous thing a person can do is decide they already know who someone is. She said it about strangers on the street, about neighbors, about everyone. She said it the first time she met me, when I showed up to our first date in my father's borrowed truck with a gas station flower arrangement because I'd run out of time. She said, I almost didn't go. My friend told me your truck was a junker, and she laughed the way she always laughed, from somewhere deep and real, and she said, Can you imagine? I can imagine. I've spent my whole life being the man in the junker truck. I chose that, after a point. It became a kind of clarifying filter. People reveal themselves quickly when they think they're looking at someone who doesn't count. Derek Calloway saw a man in a worn blazer and made a very fast decision about what that man was worth. He was wrong in the specific way, wrong about the buildings, wrong about the money, wrong about the loan his company needed, but more importantly, he was wrong in the general way. The way that costs a person something they can't always get back. My daughter-in-law, to her credit, came to me 2 weeks after the wedding and apologized. She sat across from me in my kitchen, both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and said that she'd heard what happened and that she was sorry and that she hadn't known her brother could be like that, or maybe she'd known but hadn't wanted to face it. I told her I didn't need her apology. I told her my son was lucky to have someone who sat across kitchen tables and said hard things clearly. She smiled at that, a little tearfully. He talks about you all the time, she said. He says you're the most self-contained person he's ever known. Like nothing really gets to you. Things get to me, I said. What does? I thought about it. My son's face when he thought he had to manage something he couldn't afford, I said. That got to me. She was quiet. Everything else, I said, is just noise. It's February now, 4 months after the wedding. My son and his wife are settled in their apartment. Derek's project is moving forward under the revised terms. Gerald tells me the relationship is professional and functional, which is all I need it to be. Derek and I have had dinner twice. Just the two of us, at a diner near my office, not a restaurant with crystal and European florists, just a booth and bad coffee, and the kind of conversation that happens when two people have run out of reasons to perform for each other. I don't know yet what he'll become. I know what he was. I know what he showed himself to be in the space of one night, one plate, one sentence delivered with the absolute confidence of a man who had decided the person in front of him didn't matter. I know what I showed myself to be too, in my way. Patience is a kind of power. Silence is a kind of power. The choice not to use what you have when you could, when part of you wants to, that's where character actually lives. Not in the moments when everything is going well. In the moments when the room is loud and the lights are bright and someone is holding out a plate and waiting for you to feel small. I didn't feel small. I never have. I drove home from Ashford Manor that October night in my Ford with 180,000 miles on it. And I stopped at a gas station for coffee, and I sat in the parking lot for a while and thought about my wife and the oak tree in the backyard and my son's face when he'd hugged me before the ceremony. And then I drove the rest of the way home, and I put the blazer back in the closet, and I went to sleep. Some nights are just nights. Even the ones that change things. The oak tree is still there. I still haven't replaced the porch railing. The truck runs fine. I have no plans to change any of it, because I've never needed the outside of my life to tell people what the inside is worth. They figure it out eventually. They always do.